Hey, this is Michael Lindsay from Vital MX. We're out here kicking off multiple days of testing for our 2019 250 Shootout. We've been a little bit delayed this year due to a couple motorcycles coming in late, but we finally have them in our hands and we're ready to put in the time to get you guys the info you're looking for. For all you that like it short and sweet, we have this video where I'll run through the quick results, just kind of the rounded thoughts of our test crew and what our overall opinion was for each bike and the ratings. But for you guys that like a lot of detail, that want to know everything about these machines, especially if you're looking at purchasing one, we have a massive article that breaks down all 7 of our test riders' individual thoughts on each bike and their individual ratings, which added up to come with our final score. Beyond that, we also have data from LePro, weight bias, and just a bunch of great info that shows, kind of what we use to come up with these results. All that is in the article on vitalmx.com. If you're on YouTube, scroll down, hit the link. If you're on our site, scroll down, you'll find the article. So jumping into this, 6th place is the Suzuki RMZ 250. Now this was definitely a long awaited model this year. It's got a lot of upgrades and we were really curious to see how it did once we stacked it up against the rest of the field. The biggest talking point for the Suzuki is a bunch of engine updates, mostly relying on the cylinder head, new intake, downdraft style, center port exhaust, and dual injector system. Yes, the engine is more powerful. A lot of guys like the improved mid to top, where the bike used to be all low to mid sign off and now carries itself a lot better. Still, overall engine performance is down towards the bottom of the class, but now a lot of guys consider it competitive. Instead of feeling like it was all in its own little world, now it's right there with around what we would consider the Kawi or the Honda in performance, depending upon the riding style of the rider. But what really cost the Suzuki not to step up in the rankings was the suspension settings that they brought to the new chassis. While the new chassis seems to carry the characteristics of previous Suzukis, it has great turning capability. The suspension is just straight up oversprung for the average 250 rider. For our 250 Shootout, we bring a lot of lighter guys to the table that are within that average range. And for all of them, they just felt like the suspension was constantly topped out and it made the bike feel rigid. It reacts to all the surfaces on the ground and it just creates a lot of rider feedback. The best result I got from one of our riders was the heaviest guy in the test and definitely proved that the spring rate is just kind of what made it faulty for us. By dropping the spring rate, it definitely improves this bike a lot. But without that, it definitely sits at the bottom of the board as nobody could really get the bike set up the way they wanted to. Sitting in 5th place is the Kawasaki KX250. Coming into this test, the Kawasaki is the only bike that is unchanged, albeit just a little bit of a cosmetic with some new radiator shroud colors. So we kind of know what to expect from this bike. A lot of our test riders have experience setting it up, but even with that, there's a few little bit of issues that hold it back. What every rider likes is the engine. It doesn't put out the most output in any specific region, but it's well mapped. We say year after year, it's an exciting engine to ride. It feels very responsive at all RPMs, and it makes it easy to get that little bit pick up and go. You definitely can short shift it, you can rev it a little bit. It's fun when it's loamy, when it's hard pack. It makes the bike feel light because of how you can loft it over obstacles using the power, but it just doesn't have a huge amount of power output to push it to the top of the class. Beyond that is a little bit of issue with the suspension. A lot of the riders like the shock settings, but the fork is an SFF spring fork. That separate function spring fork is a little bit hard to set up. It seems to work in a medium range, but it's hard to get both high speed and low speed performance out of it at the same time. So guys either struggle with how it feels on initial little chop while maybe getting a good enough bottom resistance, or if they get soft enough to feel compliant on rough tracks, they feel like it bottoms a lot. It's just a give take that nobody can really quite dial in. Beyond that, the chassis is a little bit small and the ergos are a little weird for some guys. It has a really low foot peg to seat height and feels really small between the legs, but with a tall bar, makes it a little bit interesting to get used to. But at the end of the day, they said there was a lot to like about this bike, but there was just a few too many negatives to push it up higher in the ratings. Now we're getting into the tight results. 4th, 3rd, and 2nd finished within just a point or two of each other, showing all 3 of these machines are really close in overall performance. But ultimately 4th place did have to go to the Honda CRF 250R. Coming off last year, the Honda was praised for its new chassis and suspension, but the engine seemed to be the big downfall. While it creates some of the best power in the class at the very highest RPM range, it's really lacking low to mid. What riders felt like it was missing is that roll-on torque that's needed to be consistent from lap to lap. So Honda went to work to try to fix that. What they ultimately did is got more performance with some of the engine's changes, in the mid-range. It makes the bike feel like it has a little bit more pickup, but it still has probably the worst roll-on torque in the class. So if you're really in hard pack conditions and the track flows a lot, the Honda is really fun because you're able to keep that pickup and keep the RPMs up, and you're really able to use that engine where it's meant to be and take advantage of the great chassis. But when it's soft or the track is tight, the mistakes start to come out, the lack of roll-on, and a little bit of irritation can develop. But what the Honda does have going for it is probably the best overall balanced chassis in the class and really good suspension that was easy for everybody to set up. In years past, everybody said you don't need power, you can have a bike that handles like a Suzuki. For a lot of us, we feel like the Honda has taken over possibly the best handling motorcycle in the class, but it just really needs more power to be able to put it any higher up the rankings. Landing in third place is the KTM 250 SXF. This has been a prior winner in this class for a really good reason. It's the lightest bike out there, it's extremely nimble, and it has a great power plant. What everybody really likes about it is the fact that it does have a good range of power. It's mostly geared towards the top end, but it still has enough low to mid-range torque to keep the majority of riders happy. Now, where there's a little bit of a fault this year seems to be a little bit in difference with the chassis changes. While the bike is a little bit more rigid in certain areas and it makes it feel a little bit more knife's edge, has some better handling characteristics, it also takes away from a little bit of the comfort at the front end. Being that the AER 48 air fork for some is a little bit hard to set up, the changes to the chassis didn't seem to help that setup issue. What a lot of guys felt was a little bit of vagueness or a little bit of harshness coming off the front end. Not that the bike didn't handle well, once they got used to it and got past that kind of guessing period of the first couple laps, they realized the KTM handles very well and has great front end traction, but there was just a little bit of comfort that was missing on some of the harder pack tracks and tracks that had a lot of stutter chop. They felt like getting the front end to settle and keep under them was a little bit harder than some of the bikes ahead of it. And from there, it still could use a little bit more roll-on torque to really be at the top of the class when it comes to power plants. But in the end, what probably cost it its position any higher up in the ranking is just trying to get that front end dialed in. Taking over second place is the Husqvarna FC250. Now, we hate to dig into and compare this too much, but it's the truth. The Husqvarna and the KTM are made in the same factory, but that does not make them the same motorcycle. The few changes on the bike are quite clear when you ride them on the track, and what really stands out with the Husqvarna is it's a much softer and easier motorcycle to ride. The chassis doesn't feel as knife edge as the KTM, but that's not a bad thing. While it may respond a little bit slower in certain situations, it's easier to set up and offers more comfort. The engine also plays a part into this as it revs a little bit slower and it has a little bit more of a torque roll-on feel, which for the majority of the riders in the class makes it more usable across a wider range of surfaces and keeps the lap times up no matter how rough the track gets. Now, where the bike does struggle a little bit is even though it's easier to set up than the KTM, it's still not the easiest to set up in the class. The AER 48 air fork is still not the most simple to dial in and takes a little bit more finicking or clicker changes than most of the bikes here to get dialed in. And it's just enough to keep the guys away from it as they seem to play with it a little more track to track. From there, the bike is very nimble and easy to grip. A few things such as a stiff seat and wide handlebars throws guys off a little bit and adds a little bit of adaptation period. But once you've spent a little bit of time on the bike, it's something that's easy enough to adapt to. Taking back over its crown in the 250 class this year is the Yamaha FZ250F. We've gotten a little bit of flack in past years for not rating this bike all the way at the top of the rankings. And albeit, yes, the engine is quite important in the 250 class, it's not everything. Yamaha went to work in those areas though by producing an overall ergonomics to the bike that is much easier for the smallest guys to ride. The prior bike was a little bit on the big side, but they've really thinned it down. It's not the smallest in the class, but it's something that everybody can jump on and feel quite comfortable with now. And the other thing it really has going for it is chassis absorption. Between that and the good suspension settings they have, pretty much every rider is able to dial this bike in on different tracks with just a couple clicks here and there. Nobody really felt like they were searching or that there was major issues in setting up the Yamaha. Moving on to the engine is where the Yamaha's always had strong point, is the torque king of the class. It can be ridden a gear higher. It's even been labeled as the Mini 450, but what it hasn't had is high RPM performance. And honestly, when you're looking at aggressive kids on 250F, that's something they're looking for. Yamaha didn't want to gear their bike totally towards that though and lose that low end, so they went to work on improving the top end of the engine, and they've been able to gain that high RPM performance and bring them into a competitive range while not giving up the low to mid grunt that everybody really appreciated from this bike. Well, we found at the end of the day what made this bike a winner was how well-rounded it is. Whether you're a pro or a beginner, between the great suspension and the power tuner app with this bike, you're able to tune the power and the chassis in any way you want, and it's pretty easy to set up. We noticed with this, almost every rider was able to check this bike off as a 1 or 2 between all the areas we look at, meaning it was able to garnish an easy win in 2019. While we had a clear-cut winner this year, we'd really implore everyone to check out the article and learn all the details of these machines, because honestly, they each have characteristics that could suit you better than others. We do pick a winner because we think it's the most overall balanced machine in the class, but pretty much any bike in this class can be set up correctly if it suits your needs. And ultimately, at the end of the day, what we're trying to do is provide you the most information to make an informed decision when you're buying your next motorcycle. So because of that, we appreciate you guys checking out our shootouts. Make sure you tune back to VitalMX.com for more in the future.